The strictest, most rigid person you know is often, quietly, one bad year away from becoming the most reckless. The most disciplined dieter sometimes becomes the person who can't stop eating. The most rigid rule follower occasionally blows up their entire life in one impulsive decision nobody saw coming, least of all them. A total reversal that leaves everyone who knew them asking what could have possibly changed so quickly. Carl Jung noticed this pattern so often in his clinical work that he eventually borrowed a 2,000-year-old term from a Greek philosopher to explain it. Because nothing in his own era's psychology had a name for it yet. No framework that took the pattern seriously as something more than coincidence. He called it enantiodromia, and once you truly understand what it actually means, it becomes very hard to ever unsee in your own life, and in the lives of almost everyone around you, from the coworker who never raises their voice, to the relative who insists they've never once broken a rule in their entire life. The concept didn't originate with Jung at all. It traces back to Heraclitus, a Greek philosopher active around 2,500 years ago, known for his fascination with constant change and his observation that opposites seem to feed directly into one another. Cold things warm, wet things dry, and in his own words, as recorded by later writers, the way up and the way down are ultimately one and the same road. Heraclitus, sometimes remembered by later commentators as a melancholic figure who despaired at how few people understood the deeper patterns running underneath ordinary events, treated this constant reversal not as a curiosity, but as one of the fundamental structures of reality itself. Jung encountered these fragments as a young, widely read student long before he had any formal psychological framework to apply them to, part of a broader personal habit of reading widely across philosophy, mythology, and religious history that would end up shaping nearly every major theory he eventually developed, from archetypes to the collective unconscious to individuation itself, and the idea apparently stayed with him for decades, quietly waiting for the right clinical context to become useful rather than purely philosophical. When he finally gave it a formal home in his own work, in his 1921 book Psychological Types, he used the Greek term directly rather than inventing a new one, naming it enantiodromia, from Greek roots meaning roughly running toward the opposite. He wasn't simply borrowing the word for flavor or intellectual decoration, and he was careful, in his own writing, to credit Heraclitus explicitly, rather than presenting the underlying insight as something he'd arrived at entirely on his own. He'd started seeing the exact pattern Heraclitus described playing out, over and over, inside the private lives of the patients sitting across from him in his consulting room, decades after he'd first read the philosopher's fragments as a student, a strange kind of delayed confirmation arriving through clinical observation rather than further reading, philosophy and clinical practice quietly converging on the same underlying conclusion from two completely different directions and centuries apart. If you're new to this channel, this is where we take one real teaching from one real thinker and break down not just the idea but how to actually use it. Subscribe if that's useful to you, because we do this every week. Jung's own formal definition from that 1921 book described enantiodromia as the emergence of an unconscious opposite over time, a phenomenon he claimed showed up reliably whenever an extreme, one-sided attitude came to dominate someone's conscious life, whether that person recognized the imbalance themselves or not, and regardless of how successful or admired that one-sided attitude appeared to be from the outside. According to his account, once that lopsided dominance sets in, an equally strong counterposition quietly builds underneath it, first just slowing the dominant attitude down, and eventually, if nothing changes, breaking through it entirely, sometimes with enough force to overturn the original attitude completely, replacing it, at least temporarily, with something almost unrecognizable by comparison. It's worth pausing here on how genuinely unusual this framing was for the psychiatry of his era, a field still trying hard to prove its scientific credibility by focusing on observable, measurable symptoms rather than abstract, philosophical patterns borrowed from ancient Greek texts. In clinical terms, he wasn't describing anything mystical. He was describing a compensatory mechanism. The psyche, in his broader framework, doesn't tolerate extreme imbalance indefinitely, treating this kind of self-correction as a basic structural feature of the mind rather than an occasional exception, built into how the unconscious relates to consciousness at every stage of a person's life, not just during moments of obvious crisis. A person who builds their entire identity around being endlessly rational, controlled, and dutiful is, in Jung's reading, not eliminating their irrational, impulsive, undisciplined side. They're simply pushing it out of conscious view, into the unconscious, where it doesn't disappear so much as it accumulates pressure, waiting for the moment the controlled surface finally cracks under a weight that had been building the entire time, unnoticed and unaddressed. One detail Jung emphasized repeatedly is exactly why this reversal so often looks abrupt and shocking from the outside, even though, in his framework, nothing about it is actually sudden at all, a distinction he considered important enough to return to across several of his later writings on the topic, worried that readers would otherwise mistake the theory for something that predicted sudden, unexplainable personality changes, rather than gradual, traceable ones. The buildup happens gradually, often over years, entirely out of view, while the visible, conscious side of the personality keeps performing its usual role right up until the moment it can't anymore, giving no outward warning of the pressure quietly accumulating underneath the whole time, invisible to everyone, including, quite often, the person experiencing it. It's a pattern that shows up in ordinary life far more often than the dramatic clinical language might suggest. Visible in something as small as a famously calm coworker's unexpected outburst over a minor scheduling mistake, or a lifelong homebody suddenly booking a trip with no planning at all after years of insisting they'd never do anything so impulsive. Jung was careful to note that this pattern wasn't a sign of weak character or poor willpower on the part of the person experiencing it. It was, in his reading, simply what happens mechanically to any psyche that treats one side of itself as acceptable and the other as forbidden for long enough, regardless of how much genuine discipline or good intention went into maintaining that one-sided position in the first place. This is part of why the people closest to someone experiencing enantiodromia are so often the most blindsided by it. They've been watching the stable, controlled surface for years, with no visibility into the accumulating pressure underneath, so the eventual break reads to them as a complete personality change arriving out of nowhere, rather than what Jung considered it to actually be: the long-delayed arrival of something that had been building quietly the entire time, waiting for an opening it eventually found, often at a moment nobody could have predicted in advance, triggered by something ordinary and small that simply happened to be the final straw, the kind of trivial incident that, viewed in isolation, could never explain the scale of what followed. Jung described this dynamic showing up across a wide range of his patients, not tied to any single type of person or any single extreme attitude, spanning ages, backgrounds, and presenting complaints that otherwise had very little in common with each other on the surface. Patients who had spent years suppressing anger under a calm, agreeable exterior sometimes arrived at what looked, from the outside, like sudden, disproportionate rage, an outburst that shocked everyone who had only ever known them as easygoing. Patients who had built their entire identity around relentless self-discipline sometimes collapsed into exactly the kind of undisciplined behavior they'd spent years defining themselves against, a reversal that felt, to family and colleagues alike, like watching a completely different person emerge overnight. Others, Jung noted, showed the same basic pattern around intellectual or religious certainty, spending years defending an unshakable position with total confidence, only to abandon it just as completely and just as suddenly once the accumulated doubt underneath finally broke through, swapping one absolute conviction for its exact opposite almost overnight. What struck Jung clinically wasn't simply that the reversal happened. It was how consistently the new opposite behavior mirrored the intensity of whatever had been suppressed to make room for the original, one-sided attitude in the first place. Almost as if the unconscious kept a precise, running account of exactly how much had been excluded and eventually collected on it in full. The more rigidly and completely a person had excluded their opposite tendency from conscious awareness, in his observation, the more forceful and disruptive that tendency's eventual reemergence tended to be, as though the pressure and the eventual release were directly, almost mathematically, proportional to each other, a pattern he noted across enough cases to treat it as clinically reliable rather than an occasional coincidence. It's tempting to treat enantiodromia as purely a cautionary idea, something to fear rather than something to work with deliberately, but Jung himself didn't frame it that way in his clinical writing, treating it instead as a predictable mechanism that, once understood, could be worked with rather than simply endured. Jung didn't limit this idea to individual psychology alone. In his later writing, he extended the same basic mechanism to explain patterns he observed at a larger societal level, arguing that entire cultures could develop the same kind of one-sided dominance, overemphasizing order, reason, or control at the expense of everything else, and become similarly vulnerable to a sudden, forceful swing toward whatever had been collectively suppressed. In his view, no less real for happening at the scale of a whole nation rather than a single patient. This application of his theory remains one of the more debated parts of his body of work, discussed and analyzed by historians of psychology to this day, precisely because applying a clinical concept built from individual patients to entire societies is a considerably bigger, harder claim to defend with the same kind of evidence a single case study can provide, and because history offers far fewer clean, controlled comparisons than a clinical practice does. Jung himself treated it as a serious extension of the theory worth taking seriously, not as a casual aside, even though it remains, to this day, one of the more contested corners of his legacy among scholars who study his work closely, debated in ways his purely clinical writing on individual patients generally isn't, a reminder that even influential thinkers leave behind work of uneven strength across different parts of their career, and that taking a thinker seriously means engaging honestly with their weaker arguments too, not only the ones that hold up best under scrutiny. Modern self-help and spiritual content has taken enantiodromia and often reduced it to something closer to a comforting slogan. The idea that everything simply, automatically balances out eventually, so extreme effort in any direction will naturally correct itself without any real intervention required from the person experiencing it. A passive, reassuring version that asks nothing of the listener beyond patience. It's easy to see why the softer version wins out in casual conversation online. It costs the listener nothing and asks for no real change. Jung's actual clinical claim was considerably less comforting than that. He wasn't describing a gentle, automatic correction toward moderation. He was describing a compensatory swing that could be just as extreme, disruptive, and destructive as the original one-sided attitude it was reacting against, sometimes more so, and rarely a tidy, self-correcting return to some healthy middle ground. There's a reason this softer, gentler version of the idea spread so easily. It requires nothing uncomfortable from the person hearing it, no self-examination, no deliberate change of behavior, just the reassuring belief that time alone will eventually sort everything out. A rigid, controlling parent's psyche doesn't simply balance out into healthy moderation on its own. In Jung's own clinical accounts, it sometimes broke, instead, into behavior just as extreme in the opposite direction, with real consequences for the people around them, not a gentle drift back toward the center that pop psychology summaries often imply. It's worth noting a genuine criticism that later scholars have raised about this theory, because a fair account of Jung's work includes the parts that remain contested, rather than only the parts that make for a tidy, confident summary. Some critics argue that enantiodromia, applied too broadly, risks becoming deterministic, implying that any sufficiently extreme position must inevitably flip into its opposite, regardless of a person's own choices, self-awareness, or deliberate effort to change course. A reading that would leave very little room for genuine agency or intervention. It's a critique worth sitting with rather than dismissing outright, because taking Jung's own writing seriously means taking its weaker, more contested claims seriously too, not just the parts that make for a compelling video. Treating every extreme trait as an automatic countdown to inevitable collapse would strip away the genuine possibility of growth, choice, and deliberate change that the rest of Jung's work spends so much time defending. That critique matters, because Jung's broader body of work, including everything this channel has already covered about individuation, actually argues the opposite. That conscious awareness of a one-sided tendency is precisely what allows a person to integrate it deliberately, rather than being forced into an uncontrolled swing later, on terms entirely outside their own control. Enantiodromia, in the most useful reading of Jung's own framework, describes what happens by default when a tendency stays unconscious and unexamined, not an unavoidable fate no amount of self-awareness can interrupt, a distinction that matters considerably for anyone trying to apply the idea usefully rather than fatalistically. None of this is about predicting an exact date or moment when a reversal might happen, something Jung never claimed to be able to do with any precision, treating the whole framework as descriptive rather than a tool for forecasting specific events. So what does it actually look like to notice this building in your own life, before it reaches the point of a sudden, disruptive break that catches everyone, including you, off guard? Jung's framework points to a specific signal worth taking seriously. Any area of your personality you'd describe as completely, uncompromisingly consistent, the trait you'd claim you never waver on under any circumstances, no matter what. It's worth being clear that Jung wasn't arguing that consistency itself is a problem, or that every disciplined, reliable person is secretly headed for a breakdown. The distinction he drew was between healthy, flexible consistency, a general tendency toward a value that still bends when circumstances genuinely call for it, and rigid, absolute consistency that admits no exceptions under any condition whatsoever, treating any deviation as a personal failure rather than an ordinary part of being human. Absolute, unwavering consistency in any single trait in Jung's clinical experience was rarely a sign of pure strength. It was often a sign of exactly the kind of one-sided suppression that eventually demands a reckoning, precisely because genuine psychological balance in his framework tends to look more flexible and situational than absolute. A person who insists they never lose their temper, ever, under any provocation whatsoever, is, in this framework, someone worth watching carefully, not because anger is inevitable, but because that particular kind of absolute claim usually means the opposite tendency has been pushed somewhere out of view rather than genuinely resolved or integrated into a fuller picture of who they actually are. A second, related signal worth watching for involves language rather than behavior. Listen for absolute words showing up repeatedly in how someone describes themselves, always, never, completely, attached to the same trait over and over, in a tone that admits no possible exception. Ordinary self-description tends to be more qualified than that, full of usually and most of the time. The switch to fully absolute language, in Jung's reading, was often a small but telling sign of exactly the kind of rigid, one-sided identity that tends to build the most pressure underneath it. The practical response Jung's framework suggests isn't to abandon discipline, structure, or any particular value a person holds strongly. It's to make deliberate, conscious room for the excluded opposite in small, controlled doses, rather than pretending it doesn't exist, until it eventually forces its own uncontrolled entrance at a time and in a form nobody gets to choose. Jung described this kind of deliberate integration as considerably less dramatic and less risky than it might sound, precisely because it happens on a schedule and scale the person themselves controls, rather than on the unpredictable schedule the unconscious eventually imposes when nothing has been consciously addressed. For someone who prides themselves on total self-control, that might mean deliberately, consciously permitting small, contained moments of spontaneity or rule-breaking, not as failure, but as planned maintenance of a part of themselves that discipline alone was never meant to eliminate entirely. Jung's own clinical notes suggest that patients who did this kind of conscious, incremental integration tended to avoid the more dramatic, disruptive version of the reversal, that patients who maintained rigid, unexamined consistency were more likely to eventually experience, sometimes years later, and with considerably higher personal cost, both to themselves and to the people who depended on them remaining stable and predictable, relationships and reputations that took years to build and considerably less time to unravel. None of this requires grand gestures or dramatic life changes. Jung's own clinical suggestions tended toward the modest and the ordinary, small enough to fit into an already busy life, precisely because the goal was steady, regular release of pressure rather than occasional, dramatic overcorrection that could just as easily become its own new form of one-sidedness. This kind of deliberate integration takes a specific form depending on which trait has become one-sided. For someone whose entire identity rests on being endlessly agreeable and accommodating, the small, conscious dose of the opposite might be practicing saying no to a minor request, deliberately and without guilt, long before any accumulated resentment has a chance to build toward something far less controlled, a single clean refusal doing more preventative work, in Jung's reading, than years of quiet, resentful compliance ever managed to accomplish on their own. For someone whose identity rests entirely on relentless productivity, it might mean scheduling genuine, unproductive rest on purpose, treating it as maintenance rather than as an indulgence to feel guilty about afterward, the same way a well-run machine gets scheduled downtime long before anything actually breaks. For someone whose identity rests on always being the reasonable, logical voice in every disagreement, it might mean deliberately allowing themselves one honest, unfiltered emotional reaction a week, expressed to someone they trust, without immediately rationalizing or explaining it away. By the time Jung died in 1961, he had spent close to 6 decades in clinical practice, And enantiodromia remained one of the ideas he returned to most consistently across that entire span, mentioned not as a passing curiosity in one early book, but woven steadily through his later writing on individuation, psychological types, and the broader structure of the unconscious, referenced again and again whenever he needed a reliable, well-tested example of how the unconscious compensates for conscious imbalance. Jung spent decades of clinical work watching the same basic pattern repeat itself across patients who, on the surface, had almost nothing else in common. The more completely someone excluded a part of themselves from conscious awareness, the more forcefully that excluded part eventually demanded to be heard, usually at the worst possible time, in the worst possible way, and usually catching everyone around them, including the person themselves, entirely by surprise. It's a strange kind of legacy for a philosopher who left behind only fragments, scattered lines quoted secondhand by later writers, none of his own complete text surviving to the present day, everything we know of his thought reconstructed from quotations preserved by others centuries after his death. And yet the core observation traveled cleanly across 25 centuries and two entirely different disciplines, first describing physical processes in the natural world, then, in Jung's hands, describing something just as reliable happening inside the human mind. The old Greek insight he borrowed to describe it holds up remarkably well outside a philosophy textbook, more than 2,000 years after Heraclitus first noticed the pattern in the natural world, rather than the human mind. Nothing pushed far enough in one direction stays there forever without a cost. The choice isn't between having an extreme trait or not having one. It's between consciously making room for its opposite now, on your own terms, in small and manageable doses, or eventually meeting it later, on terms you didn't get to choose, at a scale considerably harder to control. There's a reasonable question worth asking here, and it's fair to raise it directly. Does noticing this pattern in yourself actually change anything? Or is it just another piece of interesting trivia to file away and forget? Jung's own clinical experience suggested it genuinely does change something, provided the noticing comes with real, ongoing attention, rather than a single moment of insight, followed by a return to old habits. If this kind of breakdown of real ideas from real thinkers is genuinely useful to you, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we're doing this every single week. Tell us in the comments, is there a trait you'd call completely consistent about yourself, the kind you'd swear you never waver on?